Hello, this is Christopher Chesterman, and welcome to my presentation on process, procedure, and precedent in the Connecticut witch trials. The scene you just witnessed continues representing modern understandings of witch trials in early modern Europe as well as colonial America by first having an absurd accusation made against the accused witch.
Witch. Well, she turned me into a newt. A newt? I got better.
And then later on, an illogical comparison is made about how to tell if the accused is in fact a witch.
So, logically, if she weighs the same as a duck, she's made of wood. And therefore, a witch! A witch!
And then finally, the verdict is reached even before the weight is settled between the woman and the duck, as you can see based on the wavering of the scales. Now, while this scene is very funny and in fact from one of my favorite movies, it's still a problem in that it inaccurately portrays how witches were identified and examined. There's a long legal history of witchcraft in Europe that filtered into colonial America. Now, granted, earlier in Europe and especially England, witch trials were very arbitrary, ad hoc, based on the location and the political activities of that particular location at that time. But as time went on and England developed a modern, centralized, cohesive justice system, there were rules and procedures put in place, especially in England, that differed from much of Europe at the time. So, women were examined, torture was not allowed to be used to elicit confession, and eventually there were even procedures for accusing the witch and bringing her before a magistrate or justice of the peace, depending on the time and location. And many of these concepts filtered into colonial America. So I chose the Connecticut witch trials because they are less well known. The most famous is Salem, Massachusetts, and that has been studied exhaustively and had many different variables considered. Many of them, I personally think, is a combination of many things, but that's beside the scope of my presentation. But Connecticut has some really good examples of due process of law where we get a lot of our early jurisprudence application. Now, this was not the only thing going on, but this was a contributing factor to a modern legal system. So the first step was someone had to accuse a person of being a witch. Now, a key difference back then was that an individual who accused someone of being a witch was also the prosecutor. That's why a lot of witch trials you get people saying they're a witch, and then they proceed with the trial, asking questions, gathering evidence, etc. Now, there were judicial officials that assisted with the evidence gathering and supervised, much like we have the warrant system and the investigative process, chain of evidence, etc. But back then, it was all up to the person you had to prove. That was the key point. They had to prove. And then the accused was examined, both bodily and as well as possessionally, like their possessions, their homes would be searched, and eventually the justice of the peace would determine whether or not they could be held on bail or imprisoned for the trial and be submitted to a grand jury. After that, the accused would be subject to interrogation, to being cross-examined by others and having other witnesses testify both in favor and against them. And so there was a fair, not strict, but a recognized process for identification. Also, new sciences were coming out, new areas of study were coming out that brought experts in both from theology and science to determine if somebody was a witch. And so they would gather, for instance, apparitions had to be the same. If someone appeared to someone in one form, they had to appear to other people in that same form in order for it to count. Much like the biblical interpretation of by two or more witnesses will one be condemned. And that's really what that boiled down to. A lot more science was happening so they could investigate these happenings properly to determine if supernatural occurrences were causing the things that the woman was being accused of. There were some men accused of witchcraft, but a lot of them were women. There are a lot of other societal factors involved, such as perceptions of women living alone or who had no children or other varying social concepts. But for the most part, there was a rigorous process. Now, some of it was flawed, some of the accusations were baseless, but the point of these trials was the evolution of due process, investigation, and ultimately using evidence to determine the truth rather than speculation and belief. Thank you.